So this morning I want to think with you, we're wrapping up our series on this idea of life, the exquisite risk. And I just have a couple of quick thoughts about this third one, this third idea of how we connect more deeply to the kingdom of God in our midst. And the first two had to do with enthusiasm, bringing ourselves. And I want you to rethink that quickly because I've been thinking too about how we identify ourselves here in 1111. As I took over 12 weeks ago now, it's been an interesting kind of experience and a deep, deep, rich blessing as well, as I'm trying to sort of figure out how to grow into this, and we're all kind of growing into what this means. But one of the things is trying to figure out who we are, and it occurred to me, someone said, well, we're a come-as-you-are service. And I thought, well, yeah, we're casual. You can pretty much come in here any way you want to, and that would work. Come as you are. But then I thought, no. We're really about come who you are. Doesn't matter who you are. Doesn't matter how you orient yourself. It doesn't matter your economic status. It doesn't matter what pains or joys you're suffering from or celebrating. Come who you are is who we are. And that's what enthusiasm is. Enthusiasm really is recognizing what John Wesley referred to as prevenient grace. Prevenient grace, that idea that there's absolutely nothing we could do to win God's love. We are already a part of God. We are already a part of God's creation. We are already imbued with that old heart. We're already imbued with the love of God. It's our problem. We don't always recognize it. But that's who we are. We come to this spot already, a part of the kingdom. So that's enthusiasm, recognizing that, and then coming all in, sort of showing up fully present. The second thing we talked about was this idea of ecstasy. This idea that it's not so much an experience of stepping out of our bodies, looking for some way to induce an experience, which is what we often try to do because the realities are challenging, and so we often think, well, we have to connect to God somehow. When in reality, what we need to experience the depth and joy of life simply is to get out of ourselves and connect with others. And in the midst of that, we begin to experience this joy. So today's kind of a continuation with that as we think with empathy, the third sort of pathway that I think we can connect more deeply to God. And what I want to do is I want to just sort of suggest a couple of thoughts and differentiate between empathy and sympathy, which is sort of a typical confusion I think that most of us suffer from or get to in our heads. At least I know I do all the time. So what's the difference between that? I've shared this story once before, but to me it's just one of the most profound, and it's funny, but it's a profound illustration, I think, of what this nature of empathy is. A good friend of mine out of Minnesota by the name of Kevin Kling is a storyteller, and we were together in Kansas when he was sharing this story a couple of months ago in April. And Kevin went through a horrific motorcycle accident. His body was banged up, torn about in so many different directions, and he went through some 10 or 11 surgeries over a period of years. He already had an arm, his left arm was already shorter than his right arm, but then his right arm now was paralyzed. And he used to joke how he referred to his right arm as Scarlet, because now she simply wouldn't do anything. But he had that sense of humor about him. And so Kevin talked about how he was in the hospital on one of his many surgeries, and a kid came up to him. And the kid was wearing a hospital gown. It was a young kid, maybe 11, 12 years old. And Kevin looked down and said, "Hi, how are you doing? What's going on with you?" And the kid said, "Look at my scar," and pointed to the back of his head because he'd fallen and busted his head open. And he said, "I have 12 stitches." And Kevin said, "Really? Wow, well check mine out." And Kevin sort of released his shoulder so he could see where it starts in the back of his skull, and it went down his back and down the right shoulder, and then picked back up underneath his arm and went down the side of his body. And then he showed another one that wrapped around behind on his spine, and the kid looked up and said, "Well, what do you think of that?" And the kid said, "Yeah, but mine really hurt." And Kevin made this point that I thought was interesting. He said, well, there's no judging another person's suffering, right? I mean, isn't that the case sometimes where we find ourselves not really trying to identify so much with their suffering as to categorize where it really is in relation to real suffering? But there's a whole other aspect of this idea of empathy that I think his story illustrates. And that's the idea that we can get so wrapped up in ourselves. William Sloane Coffin, who was a preacher up at Riverside Methodist Church years and years and years ago in New York, he had said this: we can get so wrapped up inside ourselves that there's actually no smaller package than the person who can't get outside their own life. Now, we think of that as being selfish and greedy, but in reality, we get absorbed and overwhelmed by so many daily kinds of activities. Our relationships overwhelm us. Our jobs can overwhelm us. We get caught up in our own crises for any number of reasons. Our own self-consciousness, our own awkwardness. I can't tell you, for the past 12 weeks, I will confess, people will come up afterwards and they will tell me, "This was a wonderful service." That's the worst possible thing you can say to me. My wife, Linda, she'll say, "You're going to wake up in the middle of the night in a panic attack, aren't you?" And sure enough, after every Sunday, when things go really well, I go home and I have a panic attack. And I don't even want to go into I'm going to visit with Mitzi Ellington, our counselor on staff, and we're going to talk about this afterwards. She's going to say, "I didn't know about this, Tom. Let's talk about this. I didn't realize." It's so easy to get caught up in our own anxieties. It truly is. And they're not necessarily for ignoble reasons. I mean, there's some justification sometimes for our anxieties. But the fact is that when we get wrapped up in whatever we surround ourselves in, we are disconnecting from God's kingdom. And in a sense, we're presuming to be that significant a deal. The hardest thing, I think, for us sometimes is to let go. So I want to suggest a couple of things about what empathy is and what sympathy is. Sympathy divides. I'll explain why that is. But sympathy is a divisive act. Now, I know you're going to say, "Oh, I always on Facebook, I always say, I'm so sorry to hear about what's going on with you." And it feels like a positive gesture. But it's divisive, ultimately. Empathy fuels connection. But it's really hard to do. Empathy involves a couple of characteristics that are important to note. First of all, empathy involves perspective taking. It is getting out of your perspective and into another's perspective. And even if you can't identify with their perspective, you recognize that another person's perspective is where they are, where their truth is at that place, and is therefore significant. It's really hard for us to do that sometimes. Empathy stays out of judgment. In other words, it's objective. It's also one of the hardest things for us to do. I work in a large staff. I don't know how many of you all work in staff. In various staffs. Doesn't matter if you're in a church staff, if you are in a staff in the most competitive corporate takeover-oriented organization, people judge each other all the time. And when we feel overwhelmed, we naturally gravitate to those who judge like us, those who identify or we identify with, so that our judgments at least have allies. It's very difficult to stay objective. And then the third thing that I want to suggest is that empathy is recognizing emotion in another for what it is, as opposed to taking things personally. How easy it is for us to hear somebody say something and we suddenly take it personally. Even if they're angry, how hard is it for us to get out of our own perspective, to try to get into another's perspective of where that anger is coming from, where their truth is at that moment, and to experience it empathetically as opposed to defensively because we feel affronted. Happens all the time on the internet. Emails are the worst venue for communicating, I think, because we're constantly saying things, trying to be funny. It's taken sarcastic or it's taken insulting, and we're always on the defensive. And we immediately see it as a judgment. It's so hard for us to recognize emotion in another objectively without taking it personal. So the problem with empathy is that, in fact, I think that if we can practice empathy, we are engaging in what Christ told his disciples to do, to be Christ to one another, to be there for one another, to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, if we are practicing empathy. But it is so hard because, number one, it goes against every grain of who we are naturally. Naturally, genetically, we are designed for defense. We are designed for protection. Vulnerability is very threatening for any number of reasons. And so the idea of being open to one another, to being empathetic with another person, doesn't come naturally to us. Sympathy typically is one of those kinds of things that we gravitate towards. It basically is our desire to, and I don't want to say that we're being superficial, that we're not being intentional. I think we don't often know any better. But sympathy is an unconscious way, at best, of avoiding conflict. Because empathy says, let's get in it together. Sympathy says, oh, I'm so sorry about your marriage. Well, there's a lot of other good guys out there. I'm so sorry about the miscarriage. At least you know you can get pregnant. Or how about this? You know what you should do. Right? We've all been there. And our intentions are good. We're trying to be positive because the reality is empathy asks for us to be vulnerable. It asks for us to get out of ourselves, to stop putting ourselves at the center, and to simply be a vehicle for trying to connect to another and what they're feeling. And at the very least, to simply say, I really don't know what that feels like, but I'm here for you. And to just be present. It's one of the most difficult things for us to do. And we live in such a judging society, that natural tendency to move towards survival is just sort of a default for us. And it's just reinforced by the social stuff that we see all the time in the media. Now, I had this great experience a number of years ago when I was working with the National Hemophilia Association, and I was doing drumming things. And I've done drumming in here where I've talked about how drumming falls apart when you start thinking about your own drum. We've actually done that in the past, where we all of a sudden start noticing the rhythm gets out of sync. It's because one or two of us have started getting self-conscious. I don't know how to do this, or I'm really loving what I'm doing, check it out. Either one of those, and next thing you know is it all starts to fall apart. But the minute you start looking up and just playing on it and paying attention to everyone else, the minute it starts to have all these amazing layers and it moves rhythmically in sync. And I've often said, because it's not about us, it's about the group. So here we were at the Hemophilia Association, and this guy, Michael Brandywine, who used to be the director, National Camp Association director, was the keynote speaker. He did this thing that was so uncomfortable. He said, okay, I'm going to give you a survey. He gave us one of these 1 to 10 surveys. I forget what you call these kind of surveys, but, you know, extremely disagree, extremely agree, from 1 to 10. And then along these various hot button issues, you would mark where you felt. So abortion, for example, strongly disagree. Capital punishment, some kind of, you would just check it along there wherever you felt like. Social services for the needy, whatever it was, there were any number of hot button issues, probably 10 of them. The right to possess arms, for example, all of these things. And then he said, now I want you to get up and find someone who has the exact opposite marks that you have. Completely dipolar to you. And I was like, really? I don't like those people. That's why I'm who I am, and my friends are who they are. So that was what he had us do. And I want to tell you what happened was amazing. Now, I won't say that as a result of that, here's what he had you do. He had you get with somebody who completely disagreed with you, and then he would have you do one simple technique. He said, I want you to share your reason for that, why just pick one issue, and why you hold that stance. Then I want the person listening to you, I want you to ask him, they're going to ask you questions that didn't make sense. Like, can you clarify that for me? Exactly what does that mean? And you just go back and forth, clarifying a little more. There's no judgment. You're just trying to understand why a person's coming from a certain point of view. Then you do the same thing. Here's what happened. The first time he would do this in rounds. The first time it was like, okay, perfunctory. The second time it was a little uncomfortable. The third time we got deeper into asking more questions about who we were. Because at that point it was no longer about gun control. It was about fear. It was about abuse. It was about any number of issues that were personal. And then as it got a little bit deeper, we found more often than not, we all shared common experiences. Now again, I don't know how many people changed their views, their points of view, but I do know how many people suddenly had a bit more empathy, and that we were going to be a little less quick to judge because we suddenly had an insight into the humanity that we shared with others. Now, he didn't get into it theologically. I would argue theologically that that is what God calls us to do. And I want to simply to end with this idea that the most significant thing we can do to connect with the kingdom is to be open to one another. That in fact, solutions are not what is needed in our relationships, in our workplace. To experience the kingdom, offering solutions is often the worst thing we can do, or the last thing we can do. If you think of your own needs, when someone comes up and says, I know what you need to do, that's often not what we want to hear. Distractions are not what we need. What we truly most need, what most deeply need, is to feel connected, is to feel like someone is listening. And oftentimes, that's all it takes to start. I don't know what you experienced in sharing your stories just about your names, but here's what I want you to challenge you to do for this week. Every now and then I ask you to do something, okay? I do. And I don't know, you leave and you're going like, I don't know, I have no idea what that meant. To be honest, I go home and I go like, why did I say that? I don't even know what that means. So I admit that I question a lot of times the thing. This one thing I want to suggest to you I think is profound, and I will suggest it often. Before you judge anyone, before you determine that your relationship is based on this judgment or this criticism or this difficulty or this pain or this sense of somebody wronged you, before you do that, go see if you can ask them to tell you a little something about themselves. Maybe ask them, where did their name come from? See if you don't hear a little bit of your own story in someone else's story. Try to practice a little bit of empathy by way of sharing just a story. Not your story. You want them to tell you theirs so that you can discover yours. Amen.